In JavaScript, if we want to get one element out of the array, we can use a square bracket syntax. Arrays in JavaScript start with index 0. So if I log this, we're going to get olives. If I want to get the second one, I have to use index 1, I get pasta. But now we have really cool new syntax. We can use the .add method, and then I can pass the index. So index 0 will still give me olives. And if I do 1, I still get pasta. The cool thing about this syntax is I can also use -1 to get the last one. Previously, if you wanted to get the last one, you had to do this awkward food.length -1. And I also get ice cream now. So this is cleaner syntax. Remember, it starts at 0. So if you want to get the last one, you have to do -1. -2 will give me pasta here. And the cool thing is it works with strings too. So if I do favorite food.add, and it wants to give me character add. This is the method that you used before. But I can now simply use add here as well. If I do 0, I get the character P. If I do 1, I get the character I. And the cool thing is it also works backwards here. So if I do -1, I get A. This does not work with character add. So if I do this with character add, I get nothing. So this is nice syntax to have. And also because with arrays, we are used to using methods. So we say .forEach, .push, .pop, .filter, and now we have .add to get one particular element out of the array. If I go out of bounds here, so let's say -5, I get undefined. If I do positive number 10, I will also get undefined. If we look at the browser support for this, you can see it's not terrible, but it's also not great either. You can see these older browsers are not supporting it, but a sizable group of people are actually still using these browsers. You can see globally it's about 1.64% that's still using these older Chrome versions. If you look into why people are still using these older browser versions, by the way, it's often companies that don't want to upgrade their browsers because they may be using software that only works in a particular older browser. So how can we make sure that our .add method also works in these older browsers? Well, we basically have two options, and you're gonna hear about these a lot. So option 1 is transpiling, and the other option is polyfilling. Let's quickly talk about how they work. Let's start with transpiling. So I want to be able to write food.add, but this doesn't work in these older browsers. So the older browsers won't know what this means. They don't know the .add method. So you're gonna get an error in those older browsers. But with transpiling, we can make it work in those older browsers. So what we're gonna do with transpiling is we're gonna convert this into older syntax. So for example, we can simply use the square bracket syntax. Those older browsers will understand what that means. So we can just convert this into this. And if we want to get the last element out of the array, we can still use that awkward syntax like before with square brackets. So with transpiling, we're simply converting our code from new syntax into old syntax during build time. And the standard tool that does that for us is called Babel. The other option that we have is polyfilling. So let me comment this out and let me copy this over here. So now let's take a look at polyfilling. So remember, we want to be able to write food.add 0 or for example food.add -1 to get the last element in the array. But again, these older browsers don't understand this. So how can we make this work with polyfilling? Well, with polyfilling, you leave the code as is. So we're not going to touch this, but we're going to add some code to make this work. So in JavaScript, these methods come from a so-called prototype. So on this prototype, you have all the methods that you can use for arrays. And we can simply define the add method on here. So we can just assign a function to here, right? I can just assign this function, and the only thing it does is, let's say, log LOL. If I do this, and now we use the .add method, for example, I use the .add method like this. If I now save here, you can see we see LOL log to the console. Because when I call .add, it will just run this function that I have assigned to the prototype here. It's just how JavaScript works. You don't need to understand the prototype stuff right now. And also when I call this with food.add and I pass an argument, a number here, it still logs LOL because we're not doing anything with that number here. We're not accepting any input. But we can do that, of course. So we can accept some input, let's call it index, and instead of logging LOL, we may want to log that index. So now if I save here, you can see it actually logs the number 0, right? So we pass in 0, that's becoming the index, and then we just log it. Now, of course, we don't want to log the actual index. We want to get olives in this case, right? Food is this array, and we want to get the first one of the array. So instead of logging index, we want to log, let's say, food, and then square brackets at that index. So if we pass in 0, the index will be 0, and then we are just accessing the first element in the array with the square bracket syntax. So if we save here, you can see I get olives. And now if I try this with a different index, it will also work because now 1 becomes the index and we just have food 1. Which is pasta. And indeed, we get pasta here in the console log. Now, we don't necessarily want a console log in the method itself. We just want to return this. So we can just return this. And then when we call it, we can log the result of that, right? So let's just change the console logging here to where we actually call this method. Now, if I save here, we get the same result because we call it here with the index 1. Index will be 1. So we get pasta out of the array and that's being returned. So we're going to get pasta here and that will be logged to the console. All right, now we are hard coding the array food here here in this add method. But what if we have some other array? Let's say we have another array called drinks. So what we want to be able to do, of course, is we also want to be able to log drinks.add. And then let's say I do 0 here. If I save here now, I'm going to get olives again and not lemonade. I expect to get lemonade. And that's because we're using food here. So instead of hard coding food, we actually want to use the this keyword here. So in JavaScript, if you use the this keyword, that will be set to whatever you call that method on. So here I'm calling the .add method on drinks. So drinks will be this. Here in this console log, I'm calling .add on food. So this will be food. Instead of hard coding one array, we can make it reusable and make it work for other arrays as well. So if we save now, you can see I actually get lemonade. And if I do index 1, we get juice. So that's how the this keyword works in JavaScript in a nutshell. And when you use the this keyword, you want to be careful with the type of function that you're using. So here I'm using a traditional function and not an arrow function. If I make this an arrow function, you can see this will not work. So with an arrow function, the this keyword doesn't properly bind to what you're calling the method on. That's essentially the main difference between the traditional function and the arrow function. You don't really have to understand this right now. I just quickly wanted to show you that. But when you use the this keyword, typically you don't want to use the arrow function. You want to use this traditional function because this does properly bind to whatever you call the method on. Now, how can we make it work so that when I use -1 here or food.add -1, that we actually get the last one in the array? Because if I do this now, I get undefined. Because here it will be drinks -1 with the square bracket syntax. And this doesn't work with the square bracket syntax. Remember, you have to do this drinks.length -1, right? So you have to do something like this. But we want to be able to pass in -1 and it should work. So how can we make that work here? Well, here we can just check if the index is less than 0. So if it's less than 0, we can just return that awkward syntax like we had before. So it's going to be the array and that's captured in the this keyword here. And then you have that array.length -1. So it's this.length -1. So now if I save here, you can see I get coffee, which is indeed the last element in the array. So if we just include this in those older browsers and then use the .add method, this should work. We have now polyfilled the add method for these older browsers. Now you don't have to do all of this yourself. The standard tool for this is called core.js. So with transpiling, we are actually converting the syntax from new to some older syntax. With polyfilling, we keep using the syntax of .add, but we add some additional code here, usually with this prototype stuff, to make that syntax work. Now, if you're using a framework like Next.js, all of that is handled for you under the hood already. That's one of the benefits of using Next.js. So you can use new JavaScript features, not only the add method, also other methods that are new. And in Next.js with Babel, it will already be transpiled to an older version, so it will work in older browsers. Now, unfortunately for the add method specifically, there is actually an open bug issue right now in the Next.js repo on GitHub. This is not being transpiled as we speak. So the other option that we have is polyfilling. Next.js also handles that for us under the hood. So you can look in the source code of Next.js to see which polyfills they actually include. So here you can see they are importing all of this stuff from core.js, right? So we have Babel for transpiling and then we have core.js for polyfills. And Next.js already handles all of that for us. It's importing a lot of new features here from core.js. So you can see for numbers, functions, and also for arrays, right? So for example, the find method may not work in all the browsers, but Next.js already imports this polyfill from core.js to make that work. Now, unfortunately, as you can see, we don't see the add method here being imported. However, Next.js has another package here where they actually include some of their own polyfills that they've written themselves. So here, for example, they're going to check in the browser, is the flat method already defined on the prototype? If that's not the case, Next.js will actually add a function to that prototype themselves, so that you can use the flat method in all the browsers as well. Now, if you scroll through here, unfortunately, you also don't see a polyfill for the add method. And there is also an open issue about this on the Next.js GitHub repo for polyfilling the add method. So unfortunately, at time of recording, Next.js doesn't automatically transpile or polyfill this add method for us. But you can still include your own polyfill or just wait a little bit. It should be here soon enough. Until that time, it's probably best to keep using the square bracket syntax, but it's good to know that this is probably the future of accessing elements in an array. My React Next.js course is coming out soon. Check out the links in the description. Thanks for watching and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.